Welcome to I Could Talk to You All Day. I'm Lauren Lefkowitz, recovering workaholic, perfectionist, and people pleaser.
And I'm John Spears, emerging from playing small, getting caught up in the inertia of life, and always being on.
I Could Talk to You All Day is a show for executives and emerging leaders. This is not just another leadership podcast. We're here to talk about what it means to be a leader while also being human.
So join us for raw, vulnerable, and probably pretty funny conversations about shifting from surviving at work and home to thriving in the life you've always wanted. Let's get the conversation started.
John Spears.
Lauren Lefkowitz, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I am so good. And the reason I'm so good is not necessarily because everything is going peachy and rainbows and unicorns, but I'm really good because I've just come out of probably a very challenging few weeks. And I have proved to myself that I can do hard things and that I can navigate super challenging situations. And it doesn't have to be super dramatic and like crazy, crazy, crazy. And so I'm a little tired. I'm a little kind of like coming down off a roller coaster of a time, but I'm also really good because I have a really deep inner peace and sort of groundedness that I haven't had in a really long time. So yeah.
That's pretty freaking amazing.
Yeah.
I also feel like you could have added the word again to every sentence you said.
Yes. But like this time, I think I finally learned it. Like, I think I finally like internalized it. Like I knew it in my brain, but I didn't know it in my body. And
Yeah.
I was talking to my therapist earlier last week when I was like in the middle of a bunch of stuff. And I was like, we were at hang up and I was like, I can do this. I can do this. And I think I really get it now. And I think I really internalize it. And as you know, and as probably I've mentioned on this podcast before, I like the known. I like certainty. I like security. I really thrive. And when there's like black and white and very clear, stark lines, and when I know like what the parameters of something are. And as we all know, that's just not how life works. And so the lesson for my life that I'm learning is to be okay with ambiguity and discomfort and the unknown and lots of risk. And I think like I said, I think I finally am experiencing a deeper level of confidence and trust in myself and my ability to navigate the unknown and whatever might come my way in the future.
I love how we make up the story that we would like everything to be in order and standardized and feeling known and planned and predicted. Because I know for me that as soon as I achieve that, I'm like, this is boring. I mean, it is nice to like find that sort of homeostasis for a time, right? It's like a rest break. I remember when I was in corporate HR, we were doing performance reviews and goal setting. And it was the first year that there was goal setting that wasn't just like expectations of performance. It was like, what are you going to do that's new and different? And one of our attorneys in the meeting that we were having raised his hand and he said, I'd like to challenge the idea that we have to do something new. And I said, tell me more. And he said, I look at contracts, I edit contracts, I send the contracts back to the originator. I look at contracts, I edit contracts, I send the contracts back to the originator. And I said, great. And he said, there's nothing new with that. I said, how long have you been here at the company? It was like 20 years or something. And I said, oh, cool. So you remember the days when the contracts were typed up on a carbon paper in triplicate, and then like you ripped off the top copy and you sent it out with a courier so that it could could, be handled. And he said, oh yeah. And I said, do you do that today? He said, no. I said, so like at some point you moved from that to just typing on regular paper, and then it was Xeroxed and sent over. Then you moved to a computer, probably Word Perfect. Then eventually where we are now with Microsoft Word and track changes and all of that. He said, I really miss carbon paper.
Do you know what? As you were talking about, the only thing I could think about is how much I love the smell of carbon paper. It just, once you mentioned triplicate and carbon paper, my mind just went back to like when I was an intern in like 2000, and I smelled it and I was like, oh my God, I love this stuff so much.
So he was not to be convinced, but he did eventually do what we were asking him to do.
Good.
Yeah. But, if you live in a fixed mindset, right, the way that he did, and he was awesome. And he actually helped, like, really drove the launch of us allowing social media to come into our company, which was pretty cool of him. But on that front, he had a fixed mindset. And so I think we get into this idea that we're going to like things being fixed a certain way. Yeah. And then we don't. And then we change things. And then we're like, oh, I missed the days when everything was in order and I knew what was going to happen. And but as much as I love the fixed mindset, growth mindset talk, which is not our topic today,
which we can talk about all day at some point, maybe.
We could talk about it all day. I love that conversation. Today, we are actually going to talk about something that a lot of us run into in our careers, and it carries into our lives, especially when we're high achievers, especially when we're leaders, which is isolation and loneliness that comes with isolation. And this happens in the solopreneur life, in the entrepreneur building an empire life, in the corporate life. And, this episode won't come out for a few weeks, but I actually posted about that this morning. Somebody asked me yesterday on a networking call, what advice would you give 2 years ago, which was when I left the corporate life. And I said, and she had just left her corporate life and launched her coaching business. And I said, believe in yourself is one thing, which sounds like super simple, but it's not easy. But you believed in yourself enough to leave your company, to take in clients. So like, keep doing that, figure out how to do that, get coaching support, have a community, all of that. And then the other thing I said was, don't be lonely. Don't get lonely, which is so easy to do when we're working either actually by ourselves or what feels like by ourselves. So I'd love to ask you to kick off the conversation here by talking about, like, what's been your experience with loneliness as a corporate leader and or isolation, and like, how do they relate to each other?
Thanks, Warren. I think that's a really great question. And I would make the distinction in the way that I've experienced both loneliness and isolation. So I have spent a lot of my career in a role of like advisor or chief of staff, and now as a COO. And it's this really unique place where you're not wholly on one side of the team and not wholly on the other side. I was a part of an administrator's office or an executive office or the CEO's office. And I was often an intermediary where I was supposed to be able to be like the honest broker for everyone. And I was supposed to be, that really helped me to provide advice and guidance and manage up and down. And in that role as a chief of staff or an advisor, and even in the role of a COO now, I think it's one of the loneliest jobs that I've ever experienced. There aren't a lot of people, even if you have a large senior leadership team or support network, for you to be able to go to and really talk about the challenges that you experience. And I'm lucky because I even though I do have a great group of colleagues that I work with in my day job, there's still a considerable amount of loneliness that I experience in that job because I'm talking about budgets, I'm talking about confidential information, I'm talking about sort of the process of strategy that you can't articulate to other people all the time. And I'm a super collaborative person. I love to brainstorm and teamwork and co-create things with other people. And oftentimes you just can't do that in some of these roles, particularly in executive level or C-suite level roles. And so it's really, for me, creating a community and network outside of my initial sphere of influence, having a group of COOs or coaches outside of the space to be able to brainstorm and to sort of share my problems or my challenges that I'm experiencing either with my boss or with the people on my team or my peers. That's been super, super helpful for me. I also, when I experience isolation, that is a much more intentional act on my part or reaction to what's happening. When I get very stressed, when I get overwhelmed, when I am just sort of at capacity, I tend to isolate. I tend to say no to things. I tend to not return people's calls or texts. So if any of my friends are listening to this and I haven't returned a call or text in a while, it's probably because I'm under some stress or going through something and I'm pushing people away. And oftentimes that's a self-fulfilling prophecy that I create for myself, where I'm like, oh, I'm the only one. I'm so alone. No one cares. And that's actually not true. I'm actually pushing people away because I'm feeling overwhelmed or like I can't engage or have the capacity. And so this idea of loneliness and isolation, loneliness in the workplace and isolation in general is something that I'm super familiar with. And I think lots of leaders are familiar with, and we just don't talk about it a lot because we're ashamed or we're embarrassed, or frankly, we think we're the only ones that have this experience.
Thanks for sharing all of that, John. I think there is that important distinction between loneliness and isolation, right? Like, I'm a social introvert. That's how I identify myself. I love isolation. I love being by myself to recharge. However, isolation for me can sometimes lead to unintentional isolation. Right? So if I need to isolate to recharge and not be on screens all the time, and I would say get out in nature, but I'm real indoorsy. So, whatever my equivalent of get out in nature is, probably read a book on my couch. But that feels intentional and self-kind and loving and choice-based. And then if a couple of days go by and I'm still doing it, my brain is like, well, people left you alone for this couple of days, so they must not be thinking about you, right? My brain starts making stuff up, which is not true. And people haven't left me alone necessarily. I've, texted them and said hey, I'll call you back tomorrow or whatever. But we make up this story. And so for me, isolation can lead to loneliness. And when I was in my corporate life, being in HR, which, in a lot of companies falls under the COO, it didn't in my case, but I also then was really the COO. So here we go. But it is a really lonely job because there's a lot of just collegial conversation that you don't get to participate in.
Yeah.
And whether that's because people are spreading rumors or gossiping or, having fun and not being careful about what they say. I cannot tell you how many times in my career I was called HR. Oh, HR is in the room. Oh, HR is here. Don't say anything. HR is right over there. And it does make you feel kind of lonely from a social perspective. So I created my life outside of work and I had friends outside of work. And then when I would leave a job, I would take some people with me.
Yeah.
Not to another company, but we're friends now, right? That kind of thing. And so, so my corporate career ended up being pretty lonely. And then I left, and 2 years out into my entrepreneur life, I went through this roller coaster where I left and I was worried I was going to be lonely. So I joined like every networking group and I went to every webinar about sales or building your business or finding your joy or digging deeper into who you are and blah, blah, blah. And I was overloaded with networking stuff. And then I pulled all the way back because if you know me, you know that I always start with all or nothing.
Mm-hmm.
I pulled all the way back and then I got real lonely. And then I sort of wondered, did I make the wrong decision? Am I doing this right? Because, in my brain, there's only one way for me to do things right. Until I actually talk it out and realize there are 700 ways to do it right. And now I feel like I'm in this happy balance where I take some networking calls. I say no to some networking calls, working with new people all the time, but I'm choosing it. And so right now, like if you ask me today, I feel like I'm in a good balance, but I have a great understanding of the corporate loneliness. And I think you said it a little bit when you were just talking, but I want to ask you to go deeper into it, which is when we are leaders and when we are high achievers and hard workers and people trust us with confidential things, we feel very alone. We feel like we can't talk to people about things. And we feel like we must be the only person struggling with this because everyone else makes it look easy. So how do we get into that spiral of like, I'm the only one here who's super stressed and feels lonely and feels isolated and feels like nobody else gets it? And like, how do you get into that struggle?
It really makes me think of something that Brene Brown talks a lot about. And she often says that where there is perfectionism, there's also shame. And I have it from my own experience that as a type A person, a high achiever, someone who is always looking to advance my career and do more and take on more and have more of an impact, there was a lot of perfectionism in me. There was this idea of I have to do it right. I have to do it great. I have to be better than other people so that I'm the one that stands out, so that I can get the promotion, so that I can progress. And I think in that thinking, there was a lot of perfectionism. And I think I also experienced a lot of shame because we're not perfect. And that idea of perfectionism and striving for perfectionism is really a fool's errand that leaves us feeling empty and bad. And for me, it was shame. And when I experience shame, I often don't let people in. And I often push people away. And I think looking at how I'm being now, how I approach the work that I do now, it's really about practice. It's about really giving the best that I can do, really giving it my all and being really committed to something and really focusing on what am I doing as opposed to what are the outputs. And I think that shift for me has enabled me to be more honest and open about what I know and what I don't know, about when I need help, about when I feel stuck on something. I would never, ever, 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 ever before maybe a few years ago, ever admit that I didn't know what I was doing. I would fake it till I make it. I would do whatever I could do so that people only saw the part of me that I wanted them to see. And now that I made this shift, I'm just much more open and I'm much more able and comfortable to say, hey, I don't know the answer to this, or I don't know what I'm doing. So I think leaders, if you're stuck in this perfectionist, high achieving type A, always be on executive presence, I have to always inspire confidence and always be right and good, it really gives a lot of room to potentially loneliness and isolation and shame.
Yeah, I think, well, I love Brene Brown, you know that. The Gifts of Imperfection is like my version of a holy Bible.
Brene Brown, chapter 3, paragraph 2.
Exactly. Yes. I think that the perfectionism leads us to this shame.
Mm-hmm.
And then we imagine we're the only ones, and our
Mhm.
only resources are our internal coworkers, and we're not really supposed to talk to them or like, show them vulnerability. There also, I think, are a couple of awful examples of vulnerability being shown and having backfired,
Mm-hmm.
right? You hear about like the executive mom who went on maternity leave and came back and shares how hard it is to pump her breast milk while she's in the office. And then somebody is like, oh, Jenny's kind of weak, right? And somehow it blows back on this new mother who has somehow figured out how to work full time and provide her own milk for her baby. And now we think she's weak.
Right. And who came back to work 3 weeks after she had a baby because we don't have, all that stuff. So yes.
Right. And then you think of like the actual jerks, right? Like the crying CEO who was so viral last year that, came on and was crying about how he made bad decisions and now he has to lay people off and he feels bad about his own bad decisions that led to their demise. And people were not sympathetic about that. And so I think we all then like internalize this fear that people are going to think we're the crying CEO.
Yeah.
Or that people are going to think I don't want to look weak or sad or whatever, right? Like that's what I had with my chronic illness in my 30s was like, I didn't want anyone to know I was sick because I didn't want them to know that there was anything wrong with me. Well, since I've started talking more openly about chronic illness, I get DMs all the time. I get comments on posts. I get clients who have chronic illness because they relate, right? And so for me, there were a lot of lessons in being vulnerable and feeling good about telling people I was feeling bad. And also something that I learned, and, I'd love to hear your perspective on this too, is that my colleagues aren't all people inside my company.
Mm-hmm.
My support system isn't just, they're either my coworkers or they're nobody. So tell me a little bit about how you've gone about building your support systems so that when you can't go to people internally, legitimately so, because as the COO, you have this responsibility to keep certain things confidential, to keep, some planning under wraps and things like that. Like, where do you go? Who are your people besides me?
Besides you, I mean, you are, girl, you are one of my people. Yeah, I mean, I'm for real. I'm very serious about that. I think what was really important for me when I started really understanding that I wanted and needed support and began to accept support is creating really strong boundaries in my life, in all areas of my life, at work, at home, with friends, with family, with my colleagues. I don't see my colleagues as my family. You don't fire people that's part of your family. I see them as my team, and I see them as my colleagues who are, okay, maybe you fire your family. But in most cases, most people do not fire your family. So I really obviously get support from work. I have great colleagues that I go to. I have people who I can call and I can Slack and set up a meeting and say, hey, I need some support. In fact, I talked to one of my colleagues today who is in Africa, and we had a 30-minute call where I was able to say, hey, I'm really struggling. I really need help here. And she coached me in a way that was so fantastic. And I felt so much better at the end of that call than I did at the beginning, but it all was in the context of boundaries. She's someone who's really close to me and I consider a friend outside of work. I wouldn't do that with a lot of other people. But I really found other COOs. I think it's really important to find other people who are similarly situated. So I have this great network of COOs. We used to meet on a regular basis. We haven't met in a while, but that monthly call was great for me, able to say, hey, I'm working on these 3 initiatives. What do you think? How do you go about doing this? Hey, I'm having this experience. Is this normal? Like, what have you done in these experiences? And I also think it's really important to have a very strong network of friends and family that aren't necessarily going to understand everything that's happening at work, but that are able to provide you with comfort and an ear, or know when to say, you know what, John, like, let's just go do something fun. Let's take your mind off of it. Let's do something else. And so it's really about creating the kind of structure and support that you need. For me, it's having different types of people in my life that can meet different needs so that I can really recharge my battery and be refreshed. How about you?
Yeah, I had no idea there were HR networking groups out there when I was in HR until the pandemic started and we were all at home, which in my case was really for the first time. I'd never really worked from home before. And I was lonely and, either in a Zoom meeting or by myself for most of the day. And I needed HR support. And there were webinars everywhere about what to do, but there wasn't really the human touch. And I went to a webinar. It was something to do with the pandemic, but in the chat, a whole bunch of people were putting their LinkedIn profiles. Let's connect on LinkedIn. And I realized people are actually connecting from different companies. Is that what networking is? And I've been to networking events and conferences, but I'd never really kept in touch with anybody. It was sort of like, we traveled around the conference together and then it was nice meeting you and we waved goodbye. And then I started seeking out HR groups and found some people I resonated with and some people I didn't. But I realized there was this whole networking arena that I was ignoring. Right. It wasn't even in my view that existed. And then when I found it, that was what led me to over networking and then pulling back and so on. Right. We go in waves. But I found a group on Facebook that was Departments of One, HR Departments of One, which I was at the time. I was an HR department of one managing too many people in other departments, but I was an HR department of one technically. So I fit the group. And being in this Zoom room with them, I realized how alike we were. And it made me go seek out other HR events. And so even if you feel alone in your own company, or this one time you told your coworker something and then they told your manager's manager and it came back to you in some sort of twisted telephone game kind of way, and you feel like you do have to isolate inside of your company to protect yourself, it doesn't mean you have to isolate in every area and on every topic, right? And it doesn't mean that you're alone in the world. It means you get to find people elsewhere. So what advice would you give to our community if they are listeners who come to us because they understand how hard it is to be human and leader at the same time? And what would you recommend to them in order to start finding support?
Lauren, that's a really great question. I think the answer to that really depends on the individual, but I think there's probably some guiding principles that I would use regardless of who you are. One is, and we've said this a lot on this podcast, is know yourself, know what you need. There isn't a one size fits all formula for support. And so some people really need to talk it out. I'm a verbal processor. I need people to be able to talk to and to kind of get it out and to kind of, brainstorm with someone and sort of just verbalize it all. And I feel so much better when I do that. That is super supportive for me. So I know I need someone like a Lauren, like you, Lauren, that I can call and say, hey, I just need to process this thing that happened. It's kind of got me a little shaky and I just need to get it out and would love your thoughts. Some people that doesn't work for them. So really delving into who you are and testing things out. The next is what I just said around test it out. If you don't know what you need or what you want, try a few things. I think groups are really good. I think group coaching or individual coaching can be really, really helpful to get support around that. I think joining social clubs, joining groups with like-minded people, whether it's professionally like-minded people or socially, to be able to like go out and, play pickleball, which is something that I love doing, and finding a group of people doing that is really supportive because I'm being active, I'm learning, et cetera. And so kind of being inquisitive about yourself, I think is really important, testing things out and creating the space in your life to be able to do that. I have been so maxed out from a schedule perspective and a responsibilities perspective that I've really in the past not really taken care of myself. And that's led to burnout. That's led to feeling loneliness, which then has, I've taken it a step further into isolation. And so this idea support is going to look different for people, but I would say, give it a shot, try it out, figure out what you like, and then test it. What is your advice to folks, our listeners that might be in a similar place?
I would say think like frequent and small initially, right? Because something that I think I used to do to myself was, and I think this is like a real high achiever thing, was like I either was all in or all out, right? So if I was going to take a class, I needed to like be 100% sure that I could commit to every session of the class. If I was going to join a networking group that met every 2 weeks, I needed to know I was going to show up every 2 weeks. Nobody else expected that stuff of me, right? That was just like me setting my own expectations. So what I have learned for myself is not only can I just commit to like one time, one thing, one visit, one event, but I also can just leave, right? Like I went to a couple of networking events that were those sort of old school tactics of everybody put your contact information in the chat. And then let's do like a chat storm of everybody saying like, I know someone, at so-and-so, I know someone I can refer to you. Right. Ugh. The first one that I went to, I stayed for the whole thing and I felt icky the whole time. It was on Zoom. I thought there were like 80 people there and I was like, they're going to notice if I leave. Nobody's paying attention to like the individual you.
Yeah.
And if they thought I was rude because I left early, okay. And I think you can do this at an in-person networking event. I think you can do this at a Zoom event. I think it's harder if you have like a one-on-one, you've scheduled like an hour coffee and 15 minutes in, you're like, hey, you got to go. That's a little more awkward, right? Unless something like egregious happens. And then you're like, hey, I don't have these kind of conversations. I don't want to sell your essential oils. I'm out of here.
Right.
So you can just leave, right? Maybe you didn't like the meeting, but maybe you lost your internet connection, or maybe you could only attend for 15 minutes and gosh, you wish you could stay longer and maybe you'll attend sometime again. You have choices, right? And I always say, and I know you say this too, like no is a complete sentence. I don't want to be here. I'm not going to stay here. My time is valuable. My time is worth something. So if you're willing to then take like little steps in and commit to like one thing at a time, one moment at a time, it's less overwhelming than feeling like I've got to do all of it if I'm going to do any of it. John, I could talk to you about this all day.
All day.
All day. We're already at the end. Can you believe it?
I can't believe it.
I know. I can't believe it every time. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us and spreading the word. We're growing and we're excited about it. We'll see you next time.
We're so grateful you decided to be with us during this episode. Subscribe, rate, and share this podcast with your friends and colleagues, and join us next time for more Real Talk.